So greetings, everyone. My name is Stephen Feuerstein. I lead a team of developer advocates for Oracle Database. Chris Saxon is with me. He's a member of my team, as is Connor McDonald, Blaine Carter, and Dan McGann. And our jobs are to help you take full advantage of Oracle Database and all the features that it has, especially to help you develop applications, because being a developer is what it's all about these days. Before I go further, I'm glad you could join us today. Can completely understand if you couldn't join us, because there's a lot going on in the world. We hope that you're staying safe and healthy, self-isolating, taking no chances with the coronavirus, and that you make it through this unharmed, you and your family all. Okay, let's dive into the technology side of things. So we're going to talk about FORALL, and we've done previous sessions on bulk processing, but we're going to zero in on some of the more interesting aspects. So welcome to Ask Tom Office Hours. Beyond the basics with FORALL, you see Chris Saxon and all of his contact information, myself as well. I'm sure you can find us on the internet as needed. So a few things before we dive in. Don't forget that you can sign up for a free trial with Oracle Cloud, including the always free tier, always free autonomous database, compute services, storage, load balancing, and you also get Oracle Application Express, SQL Developer on the web, and many, many other tools. So take advantage of all of that. In addition, 3 really great websites that we actually are involved in ourselves: Oracle Ask Tom, the Dev Gym, and Live SQL, giving you a tremendous amount of resources for you 24 hours a day, at home or at work. So of course, you know about Ask Tom. We not only offer one of the most visited Q&A sites for Oracle Database, and it's now being answered by Chris Saxon and Connor McDonald, having taken over from good old Tom from years past. And last year, or I think it's actually, we're into our 2nd year now, we started the Office Hours program, which you probably know about since you're here. Take advantage of all of that. The Oracle Dev Gym offers classes, quizzes, workouts on SQL, PL SQL, Logic, Java. We have some Apex quizzes as well, and database design. So you can find many ways to tune up your knowledge about Oracle Database and Java on this website, and especially check out Chris's classes, Databases for Developers. So if you know developers who are new to Oracle Database, new to relational database, these 2 classes, Databases for Developers, will be fantastically useful for them. Do not need to see that. And there are many other classes as well, including Analytics SQL for Developers from Connor McDonald. So check those out if you have not already. And then, of course, Oracle Live SQL, which we'll be using today. It's not only a place where you can try out the latest features of Oracle Database. We're now running, for example, on Oracle Database 19c, but you also have access to a large code library of scripts and tutorials on a wide variety of features in Oracle Database. And we encourage you to check them out. I'll be referencing many of them today. Chris, what would you like to add?
I think it was a good summary of all our sites. I think it's also worth mentioning that we're active on Twitter as well. I've been posting some slightly different types of quizzes on Twitter recently. So if you're looking for slightly brain teaser type things about Oracle Database, follow me at Chris R. Saxon. There's posted one today. Pictorial clues to new features in Oracle Database. So I think some of them are a bit obscure. Some people are struggling with them, but if you're looking for a bit of fun, check that out.
And then on Fridays, you issue your SQL quiz, is that right?
Yes, so for a while now, since the start of the year, I've been doing a SQL puzzle. So something which seems to break the usual understanding of SQL, but actually there's some kind of cool technology really at play there, and it's just a bit of fun, bit of something to get you thinking. It's always interesting to see what crazy and weird solutions people come up with, which are completely not what I was thinking of.
That's right. It happens very often. And it's the world of programming, right? There's always more than one way to get to a solution. So yes, and you can go back, of course, check out Chris's account, but you can go back to previous Fridays and check out those puzzles. And you'll probably get some idea of the kind of twisted mind that Chris brings to Oracle Database. It's very, I mean, I don't think I've ever been able to answer any of those quizzes so far, but what he's doing is exposing different features that you might not be aware of, and of course using them in a way that you probably wouldn't, but it might give you some ideas about what you can do from there. Indeed, yep. All right. So, and in terms of the webinar today, so we have switched to webinar format. You can ask questions through the Q&A window. Click it on the bottom of your screen. There's also a chat screen. In general, we want you to move all your questions. We're not going to have we're not going to be answering questions on the chat level. Just put them in the Q&A and we'll answer them. But certainly you can have conversations with panelists or with all participants during the session through chat as well. Can you kindly post the link to the website you were just showing to learn about PL SQL? Yeah, so I will post, here are the links right here. They're really easy. asktom.oracle.com, devgym.oracle.com, livesql.oracle.com. I suppose, Chris, if you want to bang those into the chat, that'd be great.
Yeah, I'll stick those in the chat.
And I'll also make sure the slides are available online and accessible from the website. So in general, the best way to take advantage of the Ask Tom Office Hours series, let's say for PL SQL, is when you come to Ask Tom, drill down into whatever the latest PL SQL one is, and you'll see the current one that we're on now. But if you look at all sessions, we've got a very large and growing library. Now 28 videos of past recordings.
Not sharing at the moment.
I'm not sharing. I'm so glad to have a partner. Let's share. So whenever you come to an office hours session, you'll see the current session. I am sharing now, right?
Yes, you're sharing now. We can see your screen, and you see the basics of FORALL, yeah.
And if you click on all sessions, then you'll see the very long list of recordings of past sessions, including focus on bulk processing from quite a while ago, from October 2018. So, okay, the hour's not up yet. Might as well get to it. So what I'm not going to do is do a general presentation on bulk processing. What I'd like to do is drill down into some of the more interesting aspects. So what I'm going to focus on today is, first of all, working with sparse collections. So when your bind collection is not densely filled, we'll go into that, of course, in more detail. I'll touch on FORALL and dynamic SQL. I mentioned it in the advertising, the promotion of the event. Turns out there's not all that much to talk about, but I'll talk about it. And then finally, I'll spend a fair amount of time, I hope, but not without leaving time for questions, to talk through the process by which you convert from row by row to bulk processing, because it can get really tricky. Okay. But first, we had a question come in yesterday, and I thought I'd add it to our list to discuss since it intersects with bulk processing, and also to see if the person who asked it is on the call. So if you're on the call, if this looks like your question, I'll read it. We may not be able to help you too much unless you give us more information. So I'm trying to create a table from a view. The view has 2,000 rows, but it's taking 3 to 4 days to create. Yes, folks, days. What's the problem? How do I create as soon as possible? I'm running that with FORALL with bulk limit, with a limit of 1,000, I assume for the bulk processing, bulk querying phase. So my first question to all of you is the person who wrote this here? I think not.
Well, yeah, it doesn't look like we're getting any people jumping up and down saying yes at the moment.
So Chris, do you think there's anything we can really help with here?
I mean, I think we can just give some general pointers rather than specific advice, because clearly 2,000 rows in 3 or 4 days. Something's seriously wrong, right? And probably one of the big things is just how long does it take to run the underlying query generating the data, because maybe it's not the actual insert, it's getting the data that takes that time.
And still.
I mean, yeah.
3 days.
3 days to return a couple of thousand rows.
We have extremely patient users, but they've said no more than 1 day, please, for any individual query.
Exactly. Something's just gone horribly wrong there. But I think that's probably just the first starting point. It might also be, I think they said they were inserting, but there's always a chance that maybe you're inserting, there's an uncommitted session somewhere, and you've got a clash on primary keys, and you know, something like that. Check if there's something else going on. You know, particularly when something's going on for days, it's usually actually the session's blocked for some reason.
And wouldn't it time out?
I don't know if there is a timeout for general locks. You can, for DDL there is, but for just DML inserts, I'm not sure if there is. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we sure did try to help. And it's great when you ask a question, and we'll reply privately to that person, but we thought we'd give it a chance first on the session. If you do ask a question, it'd be great if you show up at the next office hours program, because it's a much more interesting way to answer questions and engage. The other general comment would be that usually you could create table as select from view, create CTAS, very common technique. This person seems to have decided that the way to do it is to query the rows out and then push them in with FORALL. Now that might make perfect sense. We don't have enough information to know if they're getting data out and then doing stuff with the data before pushing it in. But if they're just creating a table from a view, you don't want to introduce FORALL and PL SQL and bulk processing unless you really need to. Just do the create table as select. Okay, moving right along. So quick refresher, when it comes to bulk processing, what we're talking about here is running the same SQL statement over and over again with different bind variable values. And what we're trying to do is avoid the row by row processing that can easily take place. Here we have an example of a for loop with an update statement inside of it for each row retrieved. I'm going to then do the update. That row by row processing means you're moving back and forth between the SQL and PL SQL engines. So way back in Oracle 8, Oracle introduced FORALL and bulk processing capabilities. So we have the FORALL statement. And now what that means, if we take a look at our cute little movie here, which was actually created by my co-author, Bill Pribble, for Oracle PL SQL programming many, many years ago. Now what you see is that all the different update statements are bulked up. Actually, it's just one update statement, and you have an array of bind variables. They're passed over to the SQL engine. All the SQL processing is the same as before, but without the back and forth. And then it just returns the results at the end. So that's the core idea behind FORALL, and the reason that you can get an incredible boost in performance, simply reducing the number of context switches. But what I'm going to do now is say zoom right along. You know about all the basic stuff. We're not going to go into all that. Let's take a look at some of the interesting nuances you can run into with FORALL. So first of all, the classic approach to using FORALL is you'd essentially call it the for loop syntax. So instead of for, it's the FORALL keyword. But then the iteration looks the same. You have an implicitly declared iterator in low to high, usually from 1 to count or from first to last. And then you have the DML statement. And then basically that shows you that, and you reference the bind collection. That's the bind collection since we're binding it in. And you reference that iterator. And then the FORALL statement takes over. This only works if your bind collection is sequentially filled. In other words, if every element between first and last is filled. Now in this case, you can see that we don't have that situation. Our indexes are 1, 100, and 500. So what's going to happen then, Chris? You tell me. So if I try to look at an element in a collection on an index value that doesn't exist, what error does the PL SQL engine give me?
Oh, it gives you the classic error that seems to have been the dumping ground for a lot of things. That's no data found.
No data found, right? So if I try to look at this at like 499 instead of 500, I get no data found. Well, let's take a look, going over to Live SQL now. Let's take a look at what happens with the FORALL statement, because it's actually a little bit more interesting than that. So I'm just going to refresh, make sure I've got my session nice and lively. Then I'm going to search for indices of, or just even indices. And if you're not already familiar with Live SQL, if you haven't already gone exploring, just come to Live SQL and search out certain keywords. I have over 220 PL SQL scripts that I've loaded. Chris has literally dozens, scores himself. And then we have our tutorials. So first of all, let's go to FORALL with indices of. And what I've done is create a script. You can log in and run it yourself. You can download it and play around with it. I'm just going to cruise along here a little bit to get to the main point that I wanted to show first, which is, am I going to show you? No. Wait a minute. Well, did I lose that one too? I was telling Chris that I had made a number of changes to my script, and it looks like I didn't save it or overwrote it. So what we're going to do is grab this. Well, let's see. I'm sorry. I lost the change that I made. So here's the bottom line. If you try to, let's run this script. If you try to run FORALL with a non-dense collection, you will not get no data found. That's what's so curious. And I'll show you that in just a second. So we just ran the script. Let's go to the SQL worksheet. I'm going to grab this one right here. Let's go to SQL worksheet. And I'm going to change this go from 1 to, let's just make it 500. That's the same as count. So what it's going to do is go from 1 to 2 to 3. And when it gets to 2, it's going to look at that element in the collection. And according to our normal experience with collections, we should get no data found. And instead we get an Oracle error, not a PL SQL error. Element at index 2 does not exist. So a little bit tricky, a little bit surprising, but it's not another way that you get no data found. The bottom line, however, is that if you have a collection that you're binding in, and it's not densely filled, if there are gaps in between the first and last, you cannot rely on the standard in 1 to 500. You cannot, for example, do what you might do in a loop, which is begin. I won't try to be fancy in formatting here. Exception, when others, then SQL code, check your SQL code and continue. You can't do that because you can't have a begin end around your DML operations inside your FORALL statement. So the bottom line is that you cannot use the syntax if you have sparse collections. So what do you do instead? So we offer two different approaches, indices of and values of. And the basic idea with both of these is that you're creating a separate index into your bind collection. And you're basically telling the FORALL statement which of the elements in the collection you want to use. And the simplest case is to avoid these very simple sparse collections, but you can do lots more interesting things as well. And roughly speaking, the difference between these two is that the indexing collection that you use with indices of looks at the index values that are defined in your indexing collection. But with values of the indexing collection, we look at the elements within the collection itself, the values in the collection, not the indexes of the collection. So the names are pretty good. Let's take a look. So with indices of, there's one very simple use case, which is probably the one that, if you have used indices of, is the one you followed, in which your bind array, your bind collection, and your indexing collection are the same. And I'm simply saying, well, it is sparse or it might be sparse, so only use those indexes in my bind collection. Boom, boom. And then we don't have to worry about it being sparse or dense or whatever. It'll just pick out the right ones. So Chris, a question for you.
Mm-hmm. Go on.
And everybody else. Why don't we just use indices of all the time? Why don't I have as a recommendation as a PL SQL developer, never go from first to last or one to count? It might be sparse today, it might be dense tomorrow. Just use indices of all the time. What do you think?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, presumably there's a bit of overhead in overlooking up what those indexes are, and as opposed to just walking straight through if it is densely packed, you can just walk straight through it, rather than having to figure out what the index elements are. That would be my guess anyway.
So performance.
Yes.
Yeah, and let's see if anybody else chimes in. So any thoughts about why we wouldn't just always use indices of? There's performance. Anybody else? So I'll talk about performance and then we can see if anybody else comes up with it. Yep, first bet was performance. So my impression, I haven't run a test in a long time, but I believe you will see no difference in performance. Basically, the time inside the PL SQL engine it takes to iterate through a collection is crazy fast. It's not like selecting rows from a table. You're not doing anything through the SQL engine. It's all process global area session memory. So I don't think you're going to see a hit there, though I suppose I should update my comparisons and see. But here's the thing. The one problem you might have is if you make it indices of is that you might cover up a bug. In other words, there might be a problem with your data or your code and you don't notice because you're masking it with indices of. So for example, if in my code I did a select bulk collect to fill a collection, then absolutely by definition of the feature, that collection will be densely filled from one or it will be empty. So if I do a select bulk collect and then do and go from one to the count, those actually go together correctly according to how our code base works. If something happened in between those and some elements were left out or were deleted, then with going from one to count, I would get an error. I would find out that something had changed. With indices of, I would never know. So that's my suggestion is when you're writing code, you're writing it to fit the requirements and fit your assumptions. And if you assuming if it really should be densely filled, you don't want to avoid the potential bug that might occur. So we had a question come in, which version was indices of added? I believe it was added in 10G1 or release 2. I don't think it was in 8 or 8i initially, but it's been so long.
Yeah, it definitely was. I remember writing some code as a workaround because indices of didn't exist. We were on a version, I think it's one of the 10 releases, I can't remember which, where it came in, but I remember going, if only we'd upgraded, I wouldn't have to write this code to repack my array.
Yes, I have example. I called it densification, densify your collection. It's no big deal. You iterate through it, you copy to another collection, you get rid of the gaps, but why do that?
Exactly.
So that's the basic idea behind indices of. Okay, so indices of picks out just these three for updating. And you can see the impact here. The salary changes. Maybe. Yep. Salary equal to 10,000. That looks like, all right, these are all the people with 10,000, right? So we've added a few more. Excellent. In addition, so now let's look at a more interesting case. So that's just where you have a match between your bind collection and your indexing collection. But the more interesting case is when you might have different collections. So here I have a bind collection of L employees, and I have a separate collection just for my indexing. Why might I do that? Then I'll come back to this screen and show you what I did there. So in the broader sense, you can think about these, a indexing collection being separate from the main data collection. Here's my data collection. Here are my indexing collections, but notice I've got two. So I might have a situation where my bind collection has 20,000 elements in it. But so I have this single set of data, and I'm going to do multiple FORALLs, maybe against different tables, with a different set of rows from that big collection. And what I'll do is create different indexing collections according to different rules that select out the different items that I've got. And then when I run my FORALL statement, I simply specify a different indexing collection. So that would be the more complex scenario. I'd love to hear if anybody on the call has actually used indices of in this way, beyond the simple use case. So if you have, you want to share your experience, let us know. And Nils is asking, isn't it better for indices of to not to use a second collection, but use the same collection? So Nils, that only makes sense if you've got that simple use case where you're simply wanting to, your bind array is sparse, you know it's sparse, and you simply want to avoid any of those Oracle errors. You might have, in this case, the case I'm showing now, you might have a bind collection which is actually dense. There are no missing elements in this collection. It's that your logic requires you to skip over certain elements in that dense collection to pluck them out for the specific update or insert or delete that you're applying. So it's a much more complex scenario that fewer people run into, but it's certainly available to you. And that's the point of this talk today, is to make sure you're aware of that. So going back to Live SQL, notice in this case, I have a collection of Booleans indexed by integer. It doesn't matter what your collection contains with indices of. All that matters is the indexing. It has to be indexed by integer. And those values are then used. These values are picked up and then applied to this collection to find which one. So of these three rows, only 1 and 500 could possibly be updated. This one will never be updated because it doesn't appear in the index list here. And you can even add a between clause and shrink down which of those elements, which of the ranges you want to use for the indexing collection. So there's the between clause as well. And we'd love to hear if anybody has used the between clause. So let's see, regarding context switches, the context switch dialog during iteration is not absolutely 0, but less than the case of the PL SQL for loop. Am I right? So there is one, let's go back to that movie. Come on, back. So there's definitely still a context switch. There's one context switch. It might be 2 or 3, depending on the full details of the implementation. But the PL SQL engine will, when it hits the FORALL statement, it will grab this DML statement, and then it will construct an array of those bind variables, or take this array. And those are the two things that are passed across. That's the context switch. And then it comes back. So just one switch instead of 1,000 or 10,000. So it's not a reduced cost. If you might be thinking about UDF, the pragma UDF and the with clause in SQL. In those cases, we reduce the cost of a context switch at runtime by doing some of the work at compile time, but there's still a context switch. In this case, you're actually getting rid of context switches altogether, so far as I know. Other questions? I think that's it. Okay, all right. And in some other nuances, whoops. Yep, we did that. Sorry about that. Some other nuances related to having sparse collections have to do with the SQL bulk pseudo collection. So there's bulk row count and there's bulk exceptions. And in both cases, if you're working with a sparse collection with indices of or values of, how bulk row count and bulk exceptions are populated will change. And this is where I'm really sad, because I created a script to show this bulk row count going sparse and how to deal with it more effectively than you'll see in Live SQL, but I will fix it in time to come. So the bottom line is that what you'll find, you can see the problem here in this script. So now what I've got is an indices of with a indexing collection separate from my bind collection, and I run my FORALL, right? So I've done I've only updated 2 rows, the first and the 500th. Now I'm saying, all right, well, go from 1 to the count of employees and take a look at the bulk row count at that index. Right away, you'd probably think to yourself, this doesn't look good because this is the number of statements I've executed, but that's not the index value. And the bottom line is that when I try to look at those other index values, they're not defined within the collection. And what it comes down to is that the SQL % bulk row count collection is itself sparse based on what's happening with your FORALL statement. So watch out for that. I will update this script later today, and it will show you in more detail how that goes and how you want to address it. And we have a similar situation, though a bit different, with bulk exceptions. So let's look at the save exception script. If only I can type. Not going through all of this because we've done it before, but you can certainly ask questions about save exceptions if it's not familiar to you. So again, here's indices of with between. I've got save exception, so as it's iterating through all the rows all the index values that it's going to apply the update for, it'll save the exceptions, and then afterwards we can check on those and iterate through SQL % bulk exceptions count. SQL % bulk exceptions has 2 fields. Each row, each element in the collection has 2 fields: the error index, the index that it occurred on, and the error code. And in this case, what you're going to find is that we have the wrong index values for the error index. Because when you have things like indices of and you have between, where it starts and how you iterate through that collection changes. And essentially what you have to do is calculate an offset, which is what this could do here. And basically figure out, based on the starting point and the nth statement, which of the nth error, which of those correlate back to the original bind collection. Non-trivial, but again, you've got examples here on Live SQL to sort it out. Bottom line is that if you're moving to a sparse collection, there are a number of complications that you have as a result. All right, I'm going to stop for a second, see if we've got any questions that people have or comments they'd like to make.
Not seeing any other questions or comments at the moment, but it's interesting stuff on the error handling bulk row count. It's not something I'd run into.
Right, wouldn't even think about.
Yeah, exactly. It's lots of,
lots to keep track of.
Challenges.
All right, well, let's move on then to values of. So indices of, as I've explained, you have an indexing collection, and it looks at the index values in the collection. Values of is even more indirect. In this case, and I don't know if you'll see the difference here, the graphic looks almost the same, but in the values of, notice my little arrows were coming out of the side of the boxes. That's the index value. But in values of, it's getting the element inside the boxes, so that's the difference. But otherwise, it's pretty much the same. So you can have one or more indexing collections, and then the PL SQL engine will pull out of your bind collection the ones that you want to use. Let's take a look. And again, for the folks of you at home watching the show, please let me know if you've ever used values of in your code. I have never used it. It's interesting, it's good to know about, but I've never run into a scenario where I actually needed it.
I've never run into it either. Indices of, like I say,
right.
Been
that's pretty
something
common.
I can, but values of, nope.
So in this case, here's my values of collection. And it's literally what the feature says. Look at the values of the collection. So we don't care about this, and it can be sparse or dense, it doesn't matter. What we care about are the elements inside it. So it has to be a collection of integers, indexed by integer. Whereas with indices of, it doesn't matter what's in the collection, table of Booleans, table of dates, doesn't matter, not going to be looked at. So now as it goes through the values of collection, it basically says, okay, I'll go to 100, minus 77, go to minus 77, update for employee 134, go to 130667. That's update 123, go to 1070, and we never process that element. And so we should have 3 more people making that amount of money from what we had before, and that's the case, right? Now, of course, you don't have to have, right, I was going to say you don't have to have a special collection just for values of. It's actually the other way around. Indices of, you could use virtually any collection as long as it's indexed by integer, because we don't look at what's inside of it. In this case, it's always going to be a collection of integers. So you would essentially have some sort of algorithm that would fill up this collection in advance before the FORALL statement, essentially do all the work of selecting out what's needed to be changed, and then just push it through FORALL. So again, it's there and it's obscure. And I'd love to hear about anybody using it, but it looks like nobody has.
Yeah,
All
no
right.
takers for that one.
I'll keep on cruising through this because I'll end up using all of my time, but maybe we don't have a lot of questions or active chat today. It happens. So with FORALL and dynamic SQL, actually, as I realized when I was putting it together, there's not that much to talk about. So inside FORALL, you can say execute immediate in your DML statement, just like you would using execute immediate outside of FORALL. And then your bind variables, here's the :1, you would be using your again, your reference to your bind collection and your iterator. That's the key thing. You have to use that iterator in your collection reference, but it's in the using clause instead of inside the SQL statement itself. And then just to throw in a little interesting complication, if you want to use a returning clause inside your execute immediate, so returning gets information back about the rows you've just modified, then you would include the returning clause inside your SQL statement. Notice it's inside the single quotes. And you also need a returning clause outside in your execute immediate. This is actually not specific even to FORALL, just whenever you're using execute immediate like this with a returning clause. So I have a separate returning bulk collect into eNames. So you can do it, nothing particularly special about it, but you will still see that reduction in bulk in the context switches. And if anybody's got some bright idea of saying, well, in that case, can I do execute immediate, begin, execute a procedure, end, quote, and then run a procedure using bulk processing? And the answer is yes, you can do it. It will run, but you will not get the effects of bulk processing. Literally, you can actually run a dynamic PL SQL block because, as some of you may remember from the former PL SQL product manager, Bryn Ellen, an anonymous block is a SQL statement, and that proves it right here. So you can do it, but you will not see benefits, and there's really no point to doing it. It'll just confuse everyone, probably including yourself. Okay, so those are the 2 major nuances I wanted to focus on: indices, values of, touching on dynamic SQL. I've got about 25 minutes left, not bad. And what I want to do is spend the rest of the time as concisely as possible talking about the process of converting from row by row to bulk processing. So the situation here can be very simple, but in most real-world production environments, it's much more likely to be very complicated and fraught with potential errors. And it has to do partly because you're dealing with DML or transactions, so you always have to be super careful about them. And it has to do with the fact that with a FORALL statement, you can only have one DML statement inside of it. Most of us write code in which a transaction might consist of multiple DML statements inside a loop. And the question is, how do you go from the row by row approach to the bulk in that kind of situation? So here's an example of a simple old-fashioned approach, which I think at least has a little bit of a flavor of the real world in it. So I pass in my department ID, my new salary. I've got a cursor to find all the employees in that department. And then inside that cursor for loop, I have an anonymous block, a nested block, and I do my insert into my employee history table. I run some sort of complex adjustment logic, and then I do the update with the new salary. It might be this salary, but chances are it's been overridden or modified by this algorithm. If anything goes wrong, log the error and continue. And this, by the way, is one of the values of row by row processing. You get that kind of row by row treatment and handling of errors, which is really nice. Unfortunately, it's just slow. So it's running for hours, it's running for 3 or 4 days. My manager says, can you please get it down to just 1 day? And we figured, well, we better take a look at using FORALL and bulk processing. So I want to talk through the basic steps of going through this, both theoretically and then in some of the practice elements as well. Chris, before I do that, I noticed there was a big thing in the chat. Is there anything we should talk about from that?
It's a big question about FORALL and how it appears in the AWR stats. I think if you keep going, I'll see if I can find anything out about that while
Okay.
you chat, because it's not something I know off the top of my head.
And my prediction is that, first of all, on the SQL engine side, there's literally no change for FORALL. So I think it would be the same thing as running that one statement and then just executing multiple times. But I think it's just going to be one SQL ID. That's my projection. How can we distinguish when an update is invoked by FORALL? I don't believe on the SQL side you can. You have a way to do that.
I don't think there is either. I'll have a little look around.
Okay, thanks. And I'll keep on going.
Yeah, I don't think you can.
Okay. Okay, so actually before I get into my phased approach, the first thing you should do with any program like this when you're converting to bulk processing is you should sit down and document exactly what that program is doing, especially from the standpoint of transactions and error handling, because your transaction has to be intact going forward, right? The same results across all the different use cases you've got for this program should happen the same way with bulk processing. And if you don't document it in advance, there's no way you'll ever be able to write it correctly with bulk processing. In addition, so you need to make sure you document the error handling, you document the transaction, okay? And then you can start thinking through the next steps. So assuming you've done that, the basic idea when you're moving to bulk processing from row by row is you're moving to a phased approach. So again, with the row by row, for each row I fetch, I'm going to do this nicely contained transactional-based processing for that row, and then I move to the next row. But now we've got a very different situation, and it's a matter of moving in phases. So I talk about it roughly in 3 phases. Phase 1 is bulk collect all the data, basically populate your collections. Now you won't always use a bulk collect query to do that, but it's a common model, common pattern. Select bulk collect, get your rows, maybe up to 1,000 at a time using the limit clause, and then you move on. Of course, you might have a procedure that's having the collection passed in. You might construct the collection programmatically, but you've got your collection set. The next step, phase 2, modify the collection to meet the requirements of your FORALL push to the database. And I'll go on to phase 3 to explain that more easily. Phase 3, use FORALL to push the collection into the table or tables. The point about phase 2 is that you want to simplify your FORALL statement as much as possible. You don't want to be doing a lot of different processing within your FORALL statement, within the DML statement. Get your collections all ready to go and simply use FORALL for what it is, a fast push out to the database through the SQL engine. So keeping these things separate, I think, will help you keep things straight in your head. So translating the phases into code. So what I'm going to do now is go over to Live SQL and show you the basic idea here. But essentially, here's the rough focus of it. Phase 1, so I've got my employees cursor. I'm going to fetch n rows. So my bulk collect phase 1, I'm going to fetch a number of rows at once using bulk collect, not row by row. I'm going to stop when there are no more rows in my collection. Then I'm going to go to phase 3. Wait a minute, phase 1, phase 3, what happened to phase 2? Well, depending on your requirements, some of your FORALLs may not need a phase 2 of modifying your collections. In this case, I'm inserting history, so I'm basically keeping a record of what happened before, in which case I don't need to modify the collection. So I do phase 1, then phase 3, then phase 2. So now I've done my insert. Now I need to do that adjust compensation, but not for one row at a time. I'm going to do it for all the rows in the collection, all the data I've bulk collected out. So I do all the adjustments, I get that collection of salaries ready, and then I go back to phase 3, which is update the employees. So I want to point this out to say phase 1 and 2 and 3 make sense in the order they're presented, but depending on your requirements, you may have a kind of a mix-up like this, and that's perfectly fine. Let's go to Live SQL. So now I'm going to search for row by row. Will that do it for me? That doesn't do what I wanted. Row by row with dashes. We should work on our search there a little bit. Or you can look for convert. So converting from row by row to bulk processing. And this is something, if you're relatively new to FORALL or you're about to tackle one of these more complex scenarios, it is really worth stepping through this, taking your time, and making sure you understand all the steps. I'm not going to go into all the detail of it right now, but point out the major pieces. So here's my before version. There's my slow row by row processing, but boy, is that nice. I can trap my exception, I can log the information, I can keep going. And notice, if my insert fails, I don't do an update. And if my update fails, I probably should be rolling back my insert. That's not in this code, but that's another thing you have to look at. If you're doing rollbacks to save points, things can get even trickier. But this is a little bit simplified. So if my insert fails, don't do the update. And in this case, it's just a matter of course, if the insert fails, none of this code runs. And I come down here and log the error. But I have to replicate that same behavior in my phased approach, which can be tricky. Okay. The after version, well, so the before version is about 30 lines long. And the after version is, well, it's okay, right. A little bit longer. And that's just how FORALL tends to work. Chris, do you have news for us?
Yeah, so I looked into that question about FORALL processing. Yeah, basically there is no difference in what you'll see. It looks the same as a regular insert, update, delete. So there is no real way you can tell. You'll see one execution for each loop through the each FORALL loop that you do so yeah.
So it's one SQL statement. Do we see that SQL statement was executed 20 times?
So you see what so if you're doing FORALL bulk collect with a limit of 100 and going through, each 100 rows will just be one execution. You'll see 100 rows processed. Okay. Which it might be for an insert with values, that will tell you, because an insert with values will only insert one row at a time. But for updates and deletes or insert and select, then you don't know, And of course, if you have that insert in your applications, just a regular insert with values anyway, there is no real easy way to tell, basically, or at least not that I can see.
And how can I see the real number of cycles applied to the SQL ID to AWR statistics? So the answer is we don't think you can. And I guess the question might be, why does it matter? I'm not sure what the use case is. It's a valid question, not challenging your question. I'm just wondering if on a practical basis, how much of a difference it would make. Certainly, hopefully you'd be able to take your SQL ID or SQL text and you'd be able to go back and find in your code where that was run. And there are lots of ways to do that, even with tracing and the call stack. So hopefully it wouldn't be a big challenge for you to actually figure out where the code came from, which I would assume is the main issue.
Yeah.
So what's the expected wait events for this transaction? Does that have much meaning for you?
I don't think there are any real expected wait events. Hopefully you expect no waits, right? I guess maybe they're asking, is there any specific wait events for this? And I think, it's just a regular SQL statement.
Right, it's just regular SQL. There's almost no, okay.
Yeah, no real difference there.
And we did have a question on the question side. Can we use a parallel DML using FORALL? Any examples would help. So like a parallel hint on the insert. Again, you're doing individual, well, you're not necessarily doing individual row inserts, but almost certainly you are using with FORALL. So I don't think the parallel would it do much for you in that case?
I think you're right. If you're combining FORALL with parallel, it's probably not getting much benefit, because either doing single row inserts or updating, deleting a few rows, in which case it's probably you're probably better off trying to rip it out of FORALL, do a single SQL statement and put parallel in there, if that's what you're thinking about.
Which should always be your first approach. Can you do it in straight SQL?
Yep.
Okay. How do I use a parameterized cursor along with bulk processing? So they're really two completely distinct things. Let's grab this piece of code here. I should have grabbed a little bit more, but if you have a parameterized cursor, so here's my cursor, you would simply pass in the values here.
We need your screen back again, Stephen.
Thank you so much. You are really playing an invaluable role today in so many ways, Chris. So you can parameterize a cursor just as you can parameterize a function, for example, or procedure. You pass in the values when you open the cursor, but that's completely separate from the bulk processing phase. So they're certainly compatible, but there's nothing new about parameterizing cursors. I think that would intersect with FORALL. And previous limitation with FORALL is that the array can't be a table of row type, just a single type. So prior to 11G release 2, you could not use a collection of records with FORALL and reference the individual fields inside the collection. That's a thing of the past. You can definitely use FORALL with collections of records and reference the collection iterator dot field. No problem. I did have an off-topic question, which was, what is the make and model of my headset? It has an exceptional audio quality. Thank you very much. It's a Plantronics, and I can tell you the model in just a second. A Plantronics C720. Oh, I'll type it in here. And I'm glad you like it. Okay, do we have anything else? Anything else? Back to PowerPoint. Okay. Nope.
Well, there's actually, sorry, there's a question from Joseph, or question comment on busy multi-user systems. The underlying data collected in phase 1 may change in the database by the time phase 3 executes. Shouldn't you do some sort of locking to prevent data issues, basically?
Excellent point, Joseph. Thank you. So let's go and take a look at the code here for a second. So going back down to the main body of code. So this is my new version. So I'm fetching a bunch of data, then I'm taking these other steps. And Joseph's point is that in a busy production system, you might actually have people changing this data before it's adjusted and updated here. So right, so the solution there would be to select for update. So if I go back to my cursor, I would select, oh, hey, am I good or what? Have I had this question before or what? So when you select for update, you're locking the rows proactively. And the only issue here would be, of course, how long they stay locked and how much it might interfere with other processing on the application. But that's what you would do there. Thank you for pointing that out, Joseph. Okay, so phase 1, get my data. Phase 3, do my insert. Phase 2, modify my collections. Phase 3, do my updates. Now let's just look at a little bit of the nuances here, and then we'll be just about out of time. So insert history. Now what I've gotten so far is I've bulk collected my collection. Therefore, I can say go from 1 to count safely. This collection will either be empty, in which case it goes from 1 to 0, or it will have rows in it that are densely filled. So I'm going to insert it into my history table. And by the way, there are better ways to keep track of history of changes made to your tables than this, but this was written a long time ago. And I'm also returning my information. I'm returning which IDs were modified and putting them into my bulk collect. Now, if anything went wrong, and that means that Oracle, with save exceptions, Oracle goes through all the iterations, all the statements, and then it raises an exception. It raises error 24381. So I've given it a name. So I can reference it by name since we didn't do that in our standard PL SQL package. Then I go from 1 to the number of errors encountered, and I log the error. So that's consistent with what we had before. If we had an error, the insert would shortcut processing, come down and log the error. Now I'm going to log it for each one of them in bulk, essentially, a bulk logging of errors. And I'm using my bulk exceptions array to do that. But now I have to somehow communicate to my next phase, way down the list, down to my update phase. Do not do the update for this one because the insert failed. The way I'm going to do that, and this can be very application specific, is I'm going to remove from my bind collection any of those rows in which the insert failed. So I'm going to find the index in that array. I'm going to delete it. Boom, can't do the update. So again, this is the way that I solve the problem of communicating between phases in this particular situation. This might not always work for you, but it's probably a good starting point. If I remove the elements from the collection, you can't possibly do any further processing on them. Okay, but now, when I go to my update phase, I've got a problem. My employees' collection might no longer be densely filled. So I switch to indices of, using my simplest format of collection, bind collection and indexing collection the same. By the way, this is a collection of records. Here's the syntax that that person asked about earlier. Prior to 11.2, you could not do employees.salary here. You'd actually have to have separate collections, 6 or 7 different collections, and then synchronize them. Now, that's no longer the case. So now I update only those that are left, and I still have to report on errors. So if anything went wrong, I iterate through my collection, but now, and then I'm going to log the error for those. And notice here now, I've also gone in and I've added some logic to remove the history row. So this is actually not in the original one, or it might be in the original of this script, not on what you saw on the screen that I showed you. But in this version, in fact, let's go back up here and see. Yep, using save point. So this does cover that complexity too. In this case, if my insert worked, but my update failed, I'm going to roll back to before insert. So I'm going to get rid of that insert. And the way I've done that here is I'm going back and removing the history row. I've got my employee ID in. I'm going to look at, remember that array that I populated here with returning? So these are all the rows that were inserted. I'm going to go back and find that row by employee ID and then remove it. So bottom line is that it can get quite complicated. That's why you need to have things documented very clearly first. Don't even start thinking about the code that you're going to change until you document the behavior you need to replicate. And then ideally, build an automated regression test script so that you can just run the script and say, does it match? I've got my before and afters. Is it the same? Chris, any thoughts to add?
I think, like you say, just be very careful, make sure you test thoroughly. I think one of the reasons a lot of people start with row by row processing is because error handling is so easy.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's a classic thing. You go, oh, I've updated or changed a bunch of stuff, but there's a problem with one of them. It's easy if we do that one at a time, but as soon as we start doing set-based processing or bulk processing, managing that becomes a lot more complicated.
Yep.
So,
you know, and I think this is one of those situations where you don't want to proactively choose a more complex solution if you don't need it. If your code today involves updating 20 rows, 30 rows, 100 rows, several hundred rows, you'll actually see a benefit in performance by going to bulk processing, even for 100 rows. Does it matter to anybody? Probably not. So you only want to introduce this if you know there's going to be a large volume, if you know there's a challenge, or of course you have a bug reported, you've got a problem with performance you need to fix. And then you have to bite the bullet and engage in the full complexity of the feature set. But certainly, you know, if you can avoid doing that, even better. Okay, we do have a question. Export DB, export dump, and import versus bulk processing. Please comment. I'll give that one to you. It doesn't say how you should comment, just comment.
Right. Just comment. Well, you know.
I have the cutest kids.
They're not. Export import is has a completely separate purpose. Really, it's for copying data between databases, so transferring it from one system to another, or as a very crude form of backup. You know, just take a copy of the table in case we need to reload it later for some reason. Whereas bulk processing is about changing the data, really. So it's. Yeah.
Well, it's also I would think of export import as kind of like taking a sledgehammer and hitting your problem. This is a much more nuanced situation in which you're probably dealing with subsets of data. You're certainly not usually using FORALL and bulk collect to move a whole database, a whole set of tables, and so on. So they are a bit of apples and oranges. You definitely, if you were thinking I'll use export import, and then you're thinking maybe I don't know how to use it all that well, and I'd rather use FORALL instead, you probably should take a step back and ask, what are your requirements? What do you need to accomplish here? And then take a look at what are the features in the Oracle database that will help you do it. FORALL and bulk collect will almost certainly be inside a piece of code already, working on some relatively small subset of your data and needing to apply bulk changes. Okay, questions and comments. I'm done with my presentation. Chris is done with his presentation. I let him off this time.
Well, they weren't quite to start with, but some came to life halfway through, didn't we? So with some questions and comments, but I have that somewhere. And
there's a question here, a reference to a driving site hint. I'm not even familiar with that hint.
That's to do with database links. I think you need to formulate a more explain the problem you're trying to solve here in a separate session, and come back to us, because I think what you're trying to do is only kind of tangentially related to what we're talking about here. So,
and just
yeah.
as a reminder, obviously, there's no shortage of places to ask questions on the internet these days. You can go to Ask Tom and do a full-fledged Ask a Question, but also within the Office Hours program, we do give you a way, once you've subscribed, you've signed in and subscribed to that session, you can also ask questions. So if you just come into this session, come back to feedback, you can give us feedback on the session, and you can also ask questions. Yeah. I think you can only submit questions before the session started. That's why it's not showing up here, but you can certainly let us know what you thought of this session. Love to hear that. Alrighty, well, I think that we have reached the end of our hour, just in time. Thanks to all of you for joining us today. I hope that was of use to you. Feel free to follow up with any questions you've got. Give us ideas for future office hour sessions, and most of all, stay safe, stay healthy, stay isolated for at least a little bit longer.